Hello, friends. This is Dave Hurwitz, executive editor at ClassicsToday.com, here with how to build a really basic classical music library. The essential stuff for those of you who are just getting started and are looking for some direction or for some pieces of music that you can dive into and absorb. Because absorbency is the issue here. You want to soak it in and get to know it really, really, really well. The first three videos in this series talked about symphonies, and symphonies of a very particular kind. Symphonies that followed an emotional progression from tragedy to triumph or happiness or victory or whatever you want to say. But that's the general trend. But now we're going to talk about concertos for a little bit. We'll spend a little time with concertos. And concertos, for most of us, for the basic repertoire that you're going to be involved in, generally consist of two types if you're talking about works written in the classical and romantic and after that modern periods. Concertos with big, long orchestral introductions before the soloist does anything, or concertos where the soloist starts right away and participates immediately from the very beginning. They're very different, actually, in the first movement form. And we're not going to get into the first movement form in any particular detail. I've done videos about that, which you can watch if you want. But those are the two basic types from, say, 1750, 60 onwards. And we're going to talk about concertos of both types because they're very interesting. And the one I'm talking about today is a piano concerto. Now, concerto, in case you didn't know, simply means a work for a solo, a piano, a violin, a cello, a trumpet, whatever it is, and the orchestra. And the differences between the two involve how the solo interacts with the orchestra. In one type of concerto, the one with the big, long orchestral introduction, the solo and the orchestra are sort of equal principal players, at least as far as the first movements go. After that, not so much difference. And in the other kind, where the soloist starts right away and plays immediately from then on, the orchestra is an accompaniment. And the solo takes the spotlight right away and largely keeps it, although there will, of course, be exchanges back and forth and whatnot. This is a subtle difference. I'm not sure it matters at all, but it's something you should just be aware of, so that when you hear some concertos and you hear the orchestra going on and on and on, you're wondering, I thought there was a piano here, you'll know what's going on. But this one, the one we're talking about now, your first concerto in building a library, is of the latter sort, the romantic sort, the one that started around the 1820s or 30s, where the solo pops up right away and stays front and center. It's by Norwegian composer Edvard Grieg. Now, he only wrote one piano concerto. In fact, he wrote very few works in large forms at all. So this is great because he's not like, you don't have to worry about listening to 10 of them or something like that. There's just one. It's incredibly famous, incredibly iconic, incredibly beautiful, and just amazingly fresh and delightful and worth hearing. You may already know some of it. I'm going to play you actually a couple bits. I'm not going to always do musical examples in these videos, but where I think they're really helpful to get your bearings, I will toss in one or two if I can get permissions and whatnot. But anyway, the opening of this concerto is the iconic opening, well, one of a couple of the romantic piano concerto where the soloist just says, "Ha ha, here I am." And here it is. This performance features, just so we get our credit straight, Havard Gimse, piano, a wonderful Norwegian pianist, with the Royal Scottish National Orchestra under Norwegian conductor Bjarte Engeset on Naxos. So here's just the first minute or less, the opening. Now, if that isn't a statement, what is? It's just the piano saying, here I am. I've come for business. And then the principal themes of the first movement pop up. They're beautiful and fun to listen to, and you can explore them at your leisure. The other really iconic moment in this concerto appears in the finale. Now, the finale, you'll hear all these beautiful tunes, some of them based on Norwegian folk music and Norwegian dances, as this finale is, full of romantic and nationalistic character. Because this is a piece that was part of the Romantic nationalist movement, which we'll talk about in a minute. But first, I want to play the music. Now, the ending of this concerto is simply one of the most thrilling things in all of orchestral music. And it's thrilling because of one note. And you're going to hear, there's a big tune, it's beautiful, it's grand, the orchestra's playing, the piano is going up and down and doing all kinds of wonderful ripply things. And then the piano comes in with the tune and changes a single note. And that single note makes all the difference in the world. It changes a beautiful tune into an epic, thrilling tune. It's the power of harmony, appropriately used. So let's listen to that moment. It's the end of the concerto, and it's just, even now it gives me a chill, and I'll bet it does the same for you. Here it is. See? Change one note of the tune and you go from beautiful and grand to just epic and sublime. And, Grieg played this concerto for Franz Liszt, who was no slouch himself when it came to concerto writing and piano music. And when Liszt heard that, he went nuts. He went, wow, that's fabulous. He was so impressed. So, even incredibly famous people were dazzled by that particular moment, and it remains dazzling today. So this is the concerto I want you to turn your attention to. Now, I want to talk for a minute about romantic nationalism, what that means, and the kind of music you can expect to hear. You heard a sample of it. You heard a sample of it in Tchaikovsky's Fourth Symphony, which was the previous video in this series. Romantic nationalist composers, generally speaking, existed from the 1850s, let's say, up until, today. It's still happening in places. It is an effort to use the forms of classical music in the service of national musics, ethnic musics, a mixture of classical forms with traditional folk music, dance music, to give the music color, individuality, to instill in the country of origin a sense of national pride. It does all of those things. And the important thing to realize about romantic nationalism is that most of what we consider to be music in large forms is German. It began in Italy. It started as Italian, and then was taken up by the German composers in the Baroque period, and then on into the classical period in Vienna, which is not, it became sort of German, but it's actually very polyglot. Vienna is an empire. It's Eastern and Western, and it has elements of all of those things. But it became during the 19th century a sort of German preoccupation with music in large forms. And, people wanted to write symphonies and concertos and string quartets and, music in large forms. They adopted those media, largely because Germany was such a cultural powerhouse. I mean, it sat in the center of Europe. It was wealthy. It had published music publishing. It was, along with France, which had its own musical traditions that were somewhat separate, the great, what's the word, incubator, I think is the word, of instrumental and orchestral music. I mean, the fact that Germany was broken up into a zillion different bits really was a good thing, because every town had its orchestra. There was lots of opportunities to do things in Germany at the time. And all these different disparate duchies and kingdoms and whatnot were united only by culture, by a common culture. And that culture was built around instrumental music. Opera was in Italy and in France. So Germany had the orchestral stuff. After that, at the same time, after the basic forms of instrumental music were finalized, or at least proposed in Germany, other countries got into the mix. And they got into the mix as a period of nationalist evolution. All of these countries that were run by a king or whatever, they started to get separate. They had wars, all kinds of stuff happened. We know about all that, really. It all went to hell in World War I, where you have essentially the batches of countries you have today. But well before that, there was a cultural awakening in those countries, and it was led musically by certain iconic composers, Dvorak in Czechoslovakia and Chopin in Poland, and we could go endlessly and make lists, Sibelius in Finland. But here's the point I want to make, and the point that I think is important when you listen to these romantic nationalist composers. It's that every country had its romantic nationalist moment at a different time. And one of the things we need to banish from our thoughts is the traditional view of the evolution of classical music, because that will make your life miserable. Trust me. It did for me. It does for everybody. That traditional view is that you had a bunch of famous Baroque composers like Bach and Handel and Vivaldi, and then a bunch of famous classical composers in Vienna, Haydn, Mozart, and Beethoven, and then a bunch of romantic composers who wrote in this sort of German medium. And then you had opera composers like Wagner, who wrote radical music, and then music stopped using what we call traditional harmony and tonality. And you had the second Viennese school of Schoenberg and Berg and Webern, and they wrote music which we call atonal or 12-tone. And so that's the history of Western music. It's not. It's simply not. It was written by a bunch of German academicians and their followers, who unfortunately lived in the English-speaking world and all over Europe as well. The real history of music is the history of all of these different nationalities having their cultural awakening whenever they had it. Now, Grieg was writing in the 1860s and 70s in that area. He died in 1903 or somewhere, a little bit after 1900. But he was the great Norwegian nationalist composer, plain and simple. And he created a fusion of classical forms with Norwegian folk music. And so one of the joys of the Romantic nationalist movement is discovering all of these different composers. And one of the problems we've had as classical music listeners is that our understanding and valuation of music has largely been based on the German standard, which is that, these people were just followers and epicons, and their handling of form was clumsy, and all of that stuff is just total nonsense. And you need to keep it in mind. And you need to keep it in mind when you listen to this absolutely glorious piano concerto, because there is a tendency in the world of classical music to look down on romantic music, particularly from the second half of the 19th century. Some of the most iconic works in the repertoire, the works that audiences love, but that academics dislike, and they sometimes have an inordinately prominent say in trying to form the taste of listeners like you and me. And we must fight them. We must fight them tooth and nail and repudiate what they stand for. I know this sounds like a crazy way to introduce the Grieg Piano Concerto, because all you need to do is sit down and listen to it. But I raise the issue now because I want to make sure that you understand, as a classical music listener, that the point of this exercise is for you to find the music you like and not to let other people tell you what your taste ought to be based on really outdated and fallacious views of the history of music in the 19th and 20th centuries, because that's what we got. That's what we're stuck with. And this concerto, which is, I heard it first when I was, I don't know, like 5 or 6. My mother had a recording of it. I had my mom's record collection. It was with Eugene Ormandy and Philippe Entremont, the Philadelphia Orchestra. Very good performance, if I'm not mistaken. I think they did it. It was Philippe Entremont, I know. And it just blew me away as a little kid. It blows me away now. And it was only then, when I really started to get into classical music, that people started telling me things like, well, Grieg, he didn't do that much stuff in large forms, and it was all that Norwegian folky stuff, and it's not worth as much as, like, I don't know, composer X. Well, it is. And it's not for them to tell us what we're supposed to be listening to. That's all I can say. So, with that harangue in mind, and we had to do it at some point, so we might as well do it now. I want to turn you loose on the Grieg Piano Concerto in A minor as the first concerto in this series of really basic works to help you build a classical music library. I hope you enjoy it. I hope you come to love it as much as I have. There is a link to the repertoire video that discusses the various performances if you're looking for to purchase or download recordings, some that you might want to sample and listen to. Get to know it. The tunes will stick with you for the rest of your life. It is a fabulous investment of your time and attention, because it will reward you with pleasure whether you're listening to it or not. You'll be walking down the street humming it. Trust me. So keep on listening, friends. Thanks so much for joining me. Take care.